President Trump has continued his tour of the Middle East, meeting the leaders of Syria and Qatar. But what is he hoping to achieve? And will any of this make an end to the suffering in Gaza more likely? That is what we're going to be discussing on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's James in the studio, and Donald Trump is still in the Middle East. Yesterday, we were talking about his visit to Saudi Arabia, and this limited business-focused tour of the Gulf continues. He's in Qatar, and he's also met the leader of Syria. But while he's been having all of these meetings, the American president, in all these glitzy and gilded halls, there's no getting away from the fact that horrendous images continue to come out of Gaza. And so one big question that we're going to look at, among others, is will any of this make any difference to the humanitarian disaster that's unfolding there? And we're going to talk about that and lots more besides with James Landale, our diplomatic correspondent. Hi, James.
Hello.
And Katrina Perry, chief presenter for BBC News in our DC studio. Hello, Katrina.
Hello to you.
So, James, first of all, what have you made of President Trump's tour of the Middle East so far?
Well, there's a lot of bling.
That's for sure.
I thought when I was watching him yesterday greeting people standing next door to the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, and there was this long procession of people that he was being introduced to, and it struck me of the sort of the regal process of it was almost, the subjects coming to pay homage to the visiting feudal warlord.
It's like a court, isn't it?
Yeah, it is like a court. And you've come to pledge fealty. So there was a sort of, all of that sort of, and that sort of stuff, I mean, Donald Trump clearly loves it, So if you think about it, he's gone there, he's been loved, he's been given lots of stuff, he's done lots of deals, very transactional. It's exactly the kind of foreign policy that he likes. Turn up, say nice stuff, have nice stuff said about you, and do a lot of deals that he can say is going to benefit the United States financially, move on to the next thing.
Is it all over the news, Katrina, in the States, or not?
Not, I would say. I mean, it is to the extent that all of the networks and media outlets have dispatched people on the trip with him, as is the way. And, if you've sent your correspondent somewhere, you're going to use them on air. So there is a lot of that. And as James said there, the pomp and ceremony of it makes great television, like the lavender red, not red, obviously it was lavender, but, the lavender carpet that was rolled out. The giant marble rooms that he's in, all of that is being shown around. But I wouldn't say that it's kind of talking points for everyday people going about their business at this point, no.
Yeah, but having said that, he is doing and saying significant things in terms of America's place in the world, Katrina. I mean, for example, we are seeing him attacking and criticising his domestic rivals, as we were talking about with Sarah yesterday, while lavishing praise on some of the autocrats before him. We're seeing him make, again, perhaps more clear than he's ever made it before, what he thinks the United States' role is in the 21st century in terms of not really regarding the promotion of freedom and democracy as an appropriate or worthwhile mission for the United States, but again, being all about what can the United States get out of this. But I suppose that's not, that's a less tangible and an immediately accessible idea than what deal has he done? How will that directly benefit me?
I mean, that's it. And for us all, it's extremely fascinating to get this kind of Trump foreign policy doctrine that we've had, particularly in that kind of hour-long speech that he made in Saudi Arabia. But, traditionally, American voters don't vote based on foreign policy. They vote based on the economy and where their dollars are going. So I think, the really significant thing he did was lifting the sanctions on Syria, which is very dramatic and will have a very dramatic impact in Syria. And all of those remarks that you've been talking about there, that line he had about my vision for the Middle East is commerce, not chaos. It's technology, not terrorism, something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing a bit, which was really insightful into where President Trump is going with this, but that's not necessarily something that your average American voter concerns themselves with. And, you know, you need that passage of time to see whether that doctrine results in greater stability in a region, which in turn would mean a better national security situation for the US, which is what he's trying to do here.
Now, Katrina mentioned Syria. President Trump has met President al-Shara of Syria, relatively new leader of Syria, a former militant, essentially, a former leader of what was deemed to be a terrorist organization. Is that fair to say?
Yeah,
and just lifted sanctions.
He was a jihadi.
So this is
he had billions of pounds on his head.
This is amazing, isn't it? The transition, the change. Yeah. What's should newscasters take from it?
Well, I mean, again, there are lots of themes here. One is the erratic position of Donald Trump. You know, when the Assad regime fell back in December, Trump was saying, you know, Syria, nothing to do with us. You know, we don't need to get sucked into that. But he has been persuaded by the Saudis and the Turks that it is important that this new fledgling administration in Syria and Damascus survives. There's no guarantee it will. The actual leadership of the current regime there has been fairly canny in terms of hinting at the possibility of lucrative oil and reconstruction contracts for Donald Trump. There's even been talk of a Trump Tower being built in Damascus. I think that's an idea rather than a firm commitment. In other words, appealing to Donald Trump where he likes to be appealed to. And they have persuaded Trump that actually lifting sanctions and giving this new government a chance to grow itself and to establish some stability is a good thing in itself. So he has changed that position. As you say, this is the first time I think an American president has met the leader of Syria for 10, 20 years.
And Katrina, is there unity among Donald Trump's team and the wider Republican Party about his approach to the Middle East?
Well, I'll tell you something very interesting. I was speaking to the last US ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford is his name. There hasn't been an official ambassador to Syria for about 10 years. They've just had special envoys, such has the breakdown in diplomatic relations been between the two countries. But I was speaking to him, and he has welcomed President Trump's initiative here with Syria in meeting al-Shara, in lifting the sanctions. He said this is what Syria needs. And this is someone who has dedicated much of his life working for Syrians. He's won awards for campaigning for Syrian human rights and so on. He was in Syria just 3 months ago, described the country to me as completely devastated. And he was appointed by President Barack Obama, so he wouldn't have common politics, let's say, with Donald Trump in general. But he was really enthusiastic about what President Trump is trying to do here. And he said for a country like Syria, who's coming out of that Bashar al-Assad regime and everything that it has suffered during that time, to be given the chance of a fresh start, of fresh hope, of new leadership, of economic engagement, of, its own entrepreneurs getting to build their own country up. He thought it was fantastic. He thought it would cause a lot of Syrians who haven't been able to live in their country to want to go back and build businesses and build homes there.
I suppose the question, of course, is does Donald Trump stick to what he says? Because if he does, then it's clearly, all the analysis is that this is good news for Syria. And this is could potentially be a game changer. But does he stick by it? Does he stay interested in the subject? Does he flinch when there's a problem? When some foreign fighters carry out a terrorist act, or if this new government carries out some military operation against some minorities in Syria and the whole thing flares up, does he stick with this policy? What happens to all of those ISIS prisoners held in jails in northeast Syria, currently being guarded by the Kurds? What if the Turks suddenly have a go and therefore the Kurds leave these prisons and start fighting the Turks, and suddenly you've got a lot of jihadis on the run spreading out through Syria? The complications are absolutely huge. But that still doesn't sort of belie the fact that this is a significant moment for Syria.
It was interesting on that point, James, about the ISIS prisoners here. That was one of the big asks that were told from the White House that President Trump had for al-Shara. There were 5 asks, according to the White House, that Syria sign on to the Abraham Accords, that it tell all foreign terrorists to leave Syria, that it deport Palestinian terrorists, and that it help the US prevent the resurgence of ISIS. And the last one, assume responsibility for the ISIS detention centers in northeast Syria. So to your point, you know, President Trump very firmly weaving that element and that US interest into the future of Syria and his ask for al-Shara. And I also thought what was interesting was at that meeting, Crown Prince bin Salman was there. Obviously it was happening in Saudi Arabia, but they also had President Erdoğan of Turkey join on the phone as well. So, I mean, just even the optics of those 4 individuals having that meeting, just, you know, I mean, what better example can you get of where President Trump has moved US foreign policy to?
Yeah, really interesting. Now, while we're talking, while all this is unfolding, the suffering in Gaza, horrendous suffering in Gaza continues, even by the dismal standards of our times. The pictures the BBC has been broadcasting from Gaza this week have been really, really hard to watch, I think, for me personally anyway. We cannot, for the record, get into Gaza. Israel prevents international journalists from entering the territory, as well as preventing the delivery of aid supplies, which is what we're going to come on to. But the images we've obtained, and our colleague Fergal Keane has been reporting on them this week, and one line that really, really, really hit me was when he said, very simply, the hungry and the weak are everywhere. That was Fergal's line. I mean, I would, if you can bear it, I would urge you to check out his reporting. And at the same time, the United Nations has been discussing this issue. The UN humanitarian chief, Tom Fletcher, delivered a 12.5-minute speech to a session of the UN Security Council, at which he urged the Israeli authorities to stop killing and injuring civilians and lift their blockade, and urged Hamas to release hostages immediately and unconditionally and stop putting civilians at risk. Let's have a listen to some of what Mr. Fletcher had to say.
The few hospitals that have somehow survived bombardment are overwhelmed. The medics who have somehow survived drone and sniper attacks cannot keep up with the trauma and the spread of disease. Even today, the European Gaza hospital in Khan Yunis was bombed again, with even more civilian casualties reported. I can tell you from having visited what's left of Gaza's medical system that death on this scale has a sound and a smell that does not leave you. As one hospital worker described it, children scream as we peel burnt fabric from their skin. And yet we hear that we did all we could.
Katrina, did that moment resonate in the United States, that powerful speech?
It did to a point, but in this country, the viewpoint is very largely skewed towards support of Israel. And you have to remember that everything is viewed through that prism and through that lens. There's definitely been an increase in awareness of the suffering of the people in Gaza. We're seeing slightly more of those images being shown on television here in this country. But, you know, really, I will say, truly, on the BBC is where you will really see these images, particularly here in the US. That great work being done by our colleague Fergal Keane and our freelance colleagues who are working for us in Gaza. You don't see those kind of images that much in the US. And there is just such support for what Israel is doing. It's not universal, of course, and we see those protests still continuing, and we see people trying to, you know, almost put the politics aside and just save those starving people, men, women and children in Gaza. But I wouldn't say that those hearings at the United Nations get the same level of play or of interest that they do in Europe.
But what about Donald Trump on his visit to the Middle East, focused on business predominantly, no visit to Israel? Is he achieving anything in terms of Gaza? Is any progress being made towards the end of this horror?
Look, conversations are being had. Steve Witkoff is still, I think, talking to some people in Qatar about this, because obviously Qatar has very close links with Hamas. But remember, Donald Trump likes fast solutions to problems. Gaza is the quintessence of the long-term problem that it's very, very, very difficult to resolve, and all eyes at the moment are on what the Israelis are going to do next. This talk of this new offensive that they're potentially going to continue. Yeah, so there's a lot of Western sort of angst about the devastating impact of the blockade, but do we think there's going to be diplomatic progress, as a result of this trip? Not at the moment.
Well, and is there going to be diplomatic progress in terms of Ukraine and Russia? That's the other question. The big question hanging in the air as we record at 4:30 on Wednesday late afternoon in the UK is there going to be a meeting between Vladimir Putin of Russia, Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, and potentially Donald Trump of the United States? I'm not saying that's likely, but that has been floated as a possibility, or something short of that. Do we know where we are with that?
It seems to change every 5 minutes. At the moment, there's huge skepticism that Vladimir Putin will turn up. We know that President Zelensky has said he's going to Turkey, to Istanbul, come what may, and he's going to meet President Erdoğan, and he's willing to talk to President Putin if he turns up, but only to President Putin. He's not going to talk to anybody else.
Sergei Lavrov,
or a foreign minister, or others who may well turn up, because of course the initial idea of this meeting in Istanbul was the Russian idea. Donald Trump has again said that he's willing in principle to go there, but the logistics of that would be difficult. You don't move a US president from one location to another at short order, because there's a lot of logistics and security involved there. So the risk is that you have another sort of essentially what's happening here is that both Ukraine and Russia are trying to stay on side with Donald Trump. So what you had was, at the weekend, you had the European leaders, remember, Keir Starmer and Macron and Merz, sat huddled in Kiev with President Zelensky, huddled around Macron's iPhone, talking to President Trump, saying, look, right, the deal is this. We're all calling for a 30-day ceasefire and then talks. And if not, we're going to crank up sanctions on Russia. That's the strategy. Trump signs up to that. And then a day later, Putin says, oh, look, why don't we have some talks between Russians and Ukrainians in Turkey on Thursday? And Trump changes his policy and says, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's go to that. Let's not worry about a 30-day ceasefire, which, of course, originally was the American idea. So as a response to that, Zelensky thinks, right, well, I've got to go to Istanbul, so I can't be the party seen by the White House as the refusenik, the reluctant talker. And so then the question now is, how do the Russians stay on board and try to show that they were willing to talk, but that Mr. Zelensky wouldn't talk to us?
And just finally, Katrina, what is the current thinking in the White House? I mean, there's this, obviously Donald Trump's been incredibly pro-Russian for a long time, and then the feeling was maybe that he'd been running out of patience with Vladimir Putin. What's the current thinking there?
Yeah, the current thinking is that he has run out of patience. Someone in the White House close to him was saying to me that about 3 weeks ago, a line was crossed as far as Donald Trump was concerned in how President Putin was behaving, and crucially what he was doing on the ground in Ukraine, that offensive was continuing. Was, we saw it hitting hotels, residential areas and so on, and sort of President Trump felt, okay, enough is enough. Maybe thinking, I'm being played here a little bit. He's only interested in the long game. He's not interested in action. I think we've moved away now from that meeting happening tomorrow. Just Donald Trump speaking there about an hour or so ago saying, we have a very full situation. We're all booked out for tomorrow. I'm going to the UAE. So that's a just change in the language, where he was saying, oh yeah, I think I'll go there. And, he said, oh, President Putin would like me to be there, I think, but I'm very heavily booked. So that's kind of giving cover, I think, to a decision that ultimately this won't happen. But you have to imagine that whatever is happening or not is being stage managed by those three presidents behind the scenes, and we're just being presented a version of it that they want us to see. But I mean, hopefully, for everyone's sake, right, that meeting does happen tomorrow. But it seems like President Trump is coming away from that kind of pro-Russian position that he was appearing to have at the start of this administration.
Yeah. The trouble is you've probably got three different stage managers thinking they're putting on three different plays. Katrina,
Absolutely.
thank you so much. Lovely to talk to you.
You too, as always.
Thanks, James. Nice to see you.
Always good to be here. Thanks so much.
Now, at lunchtime today, we had a message from Alex at Westminster, and the message read, "Press conf on prisons at 3:30. Alex is too busy to type full words. And then we think it's some sort of emergency measures, but we don't know. And then a bit more detail. Hi, Alex.
Hi, James. I don't know why I put conf. It's not because I'm too busy.
You're too busy. You're just too busy. You can't type out the word
Maybe
conference.
I'm too lazy rather than too busy. I don't know.
So what was it?
So it was a press conference by the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, in Downing Street in front of the lectern and all that jazz. And it was effectively to set out, from her perspective, how bad the situation is in prisons at the moment. Because you'll remember, James, we had last summer, I think I'm right in saying, when a lot of prisoners had to be released earlier than they were due to be because of the overcrowding in prisons. And now what Shabana Mahmood was saying was, look, it's getting bad again, and the male prison estate's going to be full by November unless we do something about it. So she set out a couple of things. The first thing was a plan to build 3 new prisons, although I think I'm right in saying we didn't get the exact locations of where, but she said the Treasury had effectively stumped up the money to get these new prisons built and to expand the capacity at existing prisons. And the other bit of this was another change to the system. So at the moment, if you're released from prison on licence and you do something that breaches the conditions of that licence, you can be recalled back to prison and you can serve up to the rest of your sentence, whatever was left of it. But they're changing that now so that if you had a sentence of between 1 and 4 years, if you're released on licence and then you get recalled to prison, that would only be for 28 days instead of for the rest of your sentence. And that is to free up prison spaces because of this crunch in the system, again, what Shabana Mahmood called a crisis.
And that last bit particularly, is that controversial, Alex?
Well, yeah, because, if you get recalled to prison, it's normally because you've breached the conditions of the licence on which you were released from prison in the first place. And there are some technicalities around this where some, for example, some people that were serving a year or less would only be recalled for 14 days. But yeah, this is effectively, there were lots of questions about, well, who would this apply to? Would it apply to everybody? What might victims think about this? And Shabana Mahmood said that there would be some exceptions. So she said those people who will be excluded from this change would be the people who have been recalled to prison because they committed serious offences and people who were subject to high risk plans. Because clearly what the government is attempting to do is manage the risk of all of this, right? The same that they did when people were released from their sentences early last year. They are attempting to sort of manage the risk. But I think that they could cause some concern in some quarters. But Shabana Mahmood was making the argument that unless they do something about this, then the worst case scenario is that the prison system reaches capacity and there's nowhere to put anybody. And in her view, what she was articulating was that would be the worst option.
And so when she's talking, Alex, about capacity, I'd heard lots of people talking about prisons running over 100% capacity in the first place. But she is saying that the entire system altogether is at about 99% capacity. And presumably there's a danger that they simply couldn't take any more prisoners at all at some point.
Yeah, they're saying that is as soon as 5 months. It was actually quite interesting because it was Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary there, and then there was also a civil servant, the acting permanent secretary for the Ministry of Justice, alongside her setting out some of this detail, which is actually quite unusual to have that kind of format in a press conference like this. But they were saying that they could run out of prison places in 5 months' time. And the picture that Shabana Mahmood was painting was that that might mean that you had people who were, getting arrested and they couldn't be processed through the court system because there'd be nowhere to put them, So she was suggesting it would mean like a breakdown of the justice system, which is why they were taking these measures to try and avoid it. But, it is worth reiterating that I think there will be some people, victims groups and people who have been victims of crime who will be concerned about these kind of measures that are being taken and what consequence they could have for people who have committed offences. So it's clearly a bit of a balancing act from a government perspective. And it's also worth noting that even though she was also talking about what they were attempting to do to solve this in the longer term, i.e. building more prisons, she was making the argument that they didn't think they could, in her words, build their way out of the crisis, and that there was also this, as we know, a sentencing review going on by David Gauke, who was a former Conservative Justice Secretary, which is looking at the whole system. And Shabana Mahmood was pretty clear that even though she didn't want to preempt the results of that review, which we're expecting to get in the next week or two, she was saying it was her view that that review would have to look at reducing the length of some custodial sentences and having more people serving their prison sentences out in the community with the use of technology like tags and the like. So, I think there is some really significant change coming down the track here.
Well, that's all we have time for right now from Newscast. But if you want to hear this episode in full or any of our other episodes, you can do so on BBC Sounds. Bye for now.